Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. The most advanced didn't survive. The most knowledgeable drowned. Survival wasn't about wisdom. It was about elevation. The flood myths tell us something uncomfortable if we pay attention. The survivors are never the kings. They're never the high priests, with their accumulated knowledge and sacred texts. They're never the master architects who built the monuments, or the astronomers who mapped the stars. The survivors are always ordinary families who happened to be in the right place when catastrophe struck. Noah wasn't chosen because he was the wisest man alive. He was called righteous, yes, but righteousness might mean something simpler than we think. He was inland. He was away from the coast. When the waters rose, he had time to build. Utnapishtim, in the Mesopotamian version, lived in a reed house far enough from the ocean that he could prepare. Manu, in the Hindu tradition, received warning and had elevation to reach. Deucalion landed on Mount Parnassus because mountains were the only refuge. The pattern repeats across every culture. Survivors took refuge on high ground, not because they were special, but because they were geographically fortunate. Here's the brutal logic of catastrophic flooding. Coastal civilizations would have been the most advanced. The coast is where resources concentrate. Seafood, trade routes, transportation networks. Population density is higher. Specialization becomes possible. You get architects, astronomers, mathematicians, priests, scribes, craftspeople with specialized knowledge. Complexity develops. Sophistication accumulates over generations. But when sea levels rise catastrophically, the coast is exactly where you don't want to be. The sophisticated coastal cities with their accumulated wisdom, their libraries and temples and workshops, their specialists and experts, all of it was in the path of rising water. The people who knew how to build monuments, how to track astronomical cycles, how to preserve and transmit complex knowledge. They drowned. Their cities flooded. Their infrastructure collapsed. Their texts, if they existed, were destroyed. Meanwhile, upland populations, smaller groups, simpler societies, people living in mountains and highlands, survived simply because they were already at elevation. They didn't need warning. They didn't need to flee. The water never reached them. Catastrophe doesn't preserve the most advanced. It preserves the most geographically fortunate. It's a filter, and it filters based on location, not merit. The genetic evidence supports this. Analysis of human DNA suggests our population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals at some point in our recent past. 10,000 people. That's not a flourishing civilization with multiple sophisticated cultures. That's a bottleneck. That's near extinction. That's exactly what you'd expect from catastrophic flooding that destroyed coastal populations worldwide. Imagine what this would have felt like. Communities fragmenting as people fled inland. Trade networks collapsing because the coastal cities that connected them were drowning. Specialists dying with their knowledge untransmitted. The astronomer who tracked eclipses, gone. The architect who understood load-bearing calculations, drowned. The scribe who maintained historical records, disappeared. The infrastructure abandoned. The monuments left behind. The knowledge lost because there was no one left to teach it to. Survival mode erases sophistication. When every day is about finding food and water, when you're living in a cave or a crude shelter because your city is underwater, when you're surrounded by refugees all competing for limited resources in lands that were already inhabited, passing on abstract knowledge becomes impossible. You teach your children how to hunt, how to find water, how to avoid predators. You don't teach them astronomy or architecture, or the historical chronicles of kings who ruled before the flood. The flood myths themselves preserve this reality. They never say the wisest survived, or the most knowledgeable preserved their learning. They say one family survived, or a few escaped to the mountains, or the righteous were saved. And righteous might not mean morally pure. It might mean lucky. It might mean inland. It might mean alive. The most advanced civilizations drowned. The survivors were ordinary people who happened to be at elevation, and from them, from that bottleneck, from that near-extinction event, humanity had to rebuild everything. But some survivors did preserve knowledge. They passed down the stories of what happened. So how? How do memories survive centuries without writing? They had no writing, but they remembered for 10,000 years. They remembered the coastlines that drowned. They remembered the stars. They remembered the flood. Western culture has a bias. We trust writing. We trust documents. We assume that without written records, information degrades, stories change, accuracy is impossible. Oral tradition is dismissed as unreliable, prone to embellishment, more mythology than history. But that bias is wrong, and we can prove it. Aboriginal Australians maintain the longest continuous oral tradition on Earth. Stories passed down through their cultures describe specific coastal locations, specific islands, specific landmarks that are now underwater. They describe the time when you could walk to places that are now separated by ocean. They describe when Tasmania was connected to the mainland, when the coastline was different, when the geography was transformed. Geologists thought these were myths. Then they mapped the ocean floor and calculated sea level changes, and the stories matched perfectly. The locations the Aboriginal stories described really were above water. 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The oral traditions were preserving accurate geography from the end of the Ice Age, transmitted across 400 generations without writing. The stories weren't distorted. They weren't embellished beyond recognition. They were accurate enough that modern science confirmed their details. 10,000 years of oral transmission, and the core information survived intact. Or look at Polynesian navigation. For thousands of years, Polynesians crossed vast stretches of Pacific Ocean without instruments, without compasses, without written charts. They navigated by stars, by wave patterns, by bird behavior, knowledge encoded in chants and stories and passed down through generations. When Western scholars finally studied these traditions seriously, they discovered the information was precise, astronomically accurate, oceanographically sophisticated. The oral traditions preserved complex technical knowledge that worked. Jewish oral tradition maintained specific legal and cultural information for centuries before anything was written down. The Talmud began as oral teaching, memorized and transmitted with extreme care. Epic poetry traditions, the Iliad, the Mahabharata, show how vast amounts of information can be preserved through memorization and recitation. How do oral cultures do this? How do they maintain accuracy across centuries? Stories are memorable in ways that abstract facts are not. Narrative creates structure. Characters create emotional connection. Plot creates sequence. The human brain is optimized for remembering stories, not lists of data. If you want information to survive, you wrap it in narrative. Rhythm and poetry aid retention. Much oral tradition is chanted or sung because rhythm creates patterns that stick in memory. You've experienced this. You can remember song lyrics from decades ago, but not what you read last week. Music and rhythm are mnemonic devices. Sacred narratives receive community protection. When a story is considered religiously important, the entire culture becomes responsible for preserving it. Changes are blasphemous. Errors are dangerous. The community self-corrects, with elders checking younger people's recitation, ensuring accuracy across generations. And dramatic events encode better than mundane information. You remember where you were during major disasters. You remember the day that changed everything. Catastrophic flooding, watching the water rise, seeing cities drown, fleeing to mountains while everyone else dies. That creates memories so powerful they burn into cultural consciousness. Oral cultures develop specialists whose role is remembering. Memory keepers, historians, poets. These aren't entertainers. They're archivists. In cultures without writing, they are the libraries. Their training is rigorous. Their responsibility is sacred. They don't create stories. They preserve them. And accuracy matters in ways we don't appreciate. In oral cultures, changing sacred stories can be punishable by death. The stories are considered literally sacred. Connection to ancestors, to gods, to identity itself. You don't modify them. You don't improve them. You transmit them exactly as you receive them. Look at flood myths worldwide. Despite thousands of years of transmission, despite thousands of miles of separation, the structural consistency is remarkable. Divine warning. Boat construction. Animals preserved. Waters covering mountains. Landing on high ground. Beginning again. These elements repeat with precision that suggests careful preservation, not creative elaboration. Yes, theological frameworks differ. Different cultures wrap the core events in their own religious understanding. Gods send the flood in some versions. Natural forces cause it in others. But the underlying sequence remains consistent. The details stay intact. This is mythologization. Actual historical events becoming wrapped in theological framework as they're transmitted through generations. The mechanism changes from natural to divine. The explanation shifts from climate to punishment, but the core events, waters rose, people survived in boats, landed on mountains, began again, remain because they're treated as sacred truth. Oral tradition works. It's been proven. Aboriginal Australians remembered coastlines for 10,000 years. Polynesians remembered navigation for thousands. Jewish tradition remembered law and custom for centuries. And survivors of catastrophic flooding remembered the flood. They had no writing, but they remembered. Because the story was too important to forget. Because forgetting would mean losing connection to everyone who came before. Because the warning had to survive. But the stories don't just preserve facts. They preserve emotions. They preserve warnings. They preserve fear. The people who survived wanted their descendants to remember. Why? They didn't tell the story to entertain children. They told it because forgetting could kill everyone. The water rose once. It could rise again. Trauma creates memory. Not just personal trauma, but collective trauma, cultural trauma, the kind of catastrophic event that defines a civilization's entire understanding of itself. When something terrible enough happens, survivors feel compelled to share what they experienced, not just to process it emotionally, but to warn, to prepare, to make certain it never happens again, or that if it does, people will recognize it and know what to do. Never forget. We say this about the Holocaust, about genocides, about disasters and wars and catastrophes. It's not just about honoring the dead, though that matters. It's about prevention, about maintaining awareness that these things are possible, that they happened before, that they could happen again if we're not vigilant. Flood survivors would have felt the same imperative. They'd watched the world drown. They'd seen everyone they knew die. They'd witnessed the complete destruction of their civilization. That kind of trauma doesn't fade. It demands to be remembered. It insists on being transmitted. But beyond trauma, there's practical warning. If catastrophic flooding happened before, it could happen again. The stories function as cultural warning systems, maintaining awareness across generations that the water can rise, that the seas aren't stable, that what seems permanent can disappear beneath the waves. The myths aren't just history, they're prophecy. They're saying, this happened, so watch for the signs. If the waters start rising, don't wait. If the animals start behaving strangely, pay attention. If the weather becomes unusual, prepare. The warning is encoded in narrative form because narrative survives. Because stories are remembered when abstract warnings are forgotten. And there's identity. The flood becomes the defining event of the culture. Everything is measured against it. There's before the flood and after the flood. The Sumerian king list explicitly divides history this way. Kings who ruled before the flood swept over, and different kings who ruled after. Chinese chronology is structured around Yu's control of the waters. Biblical genealogy traces lineage through Noah. Hindu cosmology counts world ages by the catastrophes that ended them. Remembering the catastrophe connects present to past. It legitimizes current society as descendants of survivors, blessed or chosen or simply fortunate enough to continue. It provides continuity across the gap, bridging the break in civilization. maintaining link to ancestors, even though everything they built was destroyed. The stories also encode ethics. Noah was righteous, while others were wicked. Deucalion was pious, while others were impious. The wooden people in Mayan myth were destroyed because they were empty, soulless. The pattern repeats. Righteousness leads to survival. Wickedness leads to destruction. The flood becomes moral teaching, warning that behavior has consequences, that cosmic forces or divine judgment responds to human actions. This makes the memory serve social function. Parents tell children the flood story not just as history, but as ethics. Be righteous like Noah, or you'll drown with the wicked. Respect the gods like Deucalion, or you'll be destroyed like Lycaon. Remember your makers like proper humans, or you'll be unmade like the wooden people. The catastrophe becomes reinforcement for moral codes. All these functions, trauma, warning, identity, ethics, made flood stories sacred. They weren't optional. They weren't entertainment. They were essential cultural information that absolutely had to be transmitted accurately to every generation. Many flood myths include explicit instructions to remember. God tells Noah that this covenant is for all future generations. The rainbow is a sign not just for the survivors, but for their descendants, forever. Survivors are commanded to tell what happened, to make certain the memory survives. This is conscious preservation of historical memory. The survivors knew they were creating a record. They knew they were transmitting warning. They encoded the most important information. The waters rose. The world drowned. Only those at elevation survived. Begin again, but remember what was lost. In the most durable format they had. Sacred narrative, protected by religion, transmitted through ritual, repeated until every member of the culture knew it by heart. Compare this to modern Holocaust remembrance. Never forget isn't just about historical accuracy. It's about preventing recurrence. It's about honoring victims. It's about maintaining identity. It's about warning future generations that these horrors are possible, that humans are capable of this evil, that vigilance matters. Flood myths might function identically. Memory of actual catastrophe maintained across 10,000 years, because forgetting would dishonor everyone who drowned, because forgetting would endanger descendants who need to know catastrophe is possible, because forgetting would sever connection to ancestral identity, to the reality that we are survivors, that we descend from people who endured world-ending disaster. If flood myths are historical memory, they're also prophecy. What happened before could happen again. The water rose once. Under the right conditions, rapid climate change, ice sheet collapse, whatever mechanism triggered it before, the water could rise again. And the stories are trying to warn us. They preserve the memory because survival depended on it, because the information was too valuable to lose, because someone had to remember when the world nearly ended, so that if the signs appeared again, people would recognize them, would know to head for high ground, would know to prepare, would know, above all, that catastrophe is possible, that the world can drown, that nothing is permanent. So now we understand. The stories are real. Not literal in every detail, but real. Preserving memory of actual catastrophe. But what does this mean? What do we do with this understanding? We asked why every culture remembers the same catastrophe. Now we know, because it happened. They remember because it was real. Let's trace back through what we've learned, because the pieces fit together in ways that should change how we see everything. We began with a pattern. Over 200 cultures across every inhabited continent, preserving flood myths with striking similarities. Not vague stories about heavy rain, but specific narratives with repeating elements. Divine warning or natural omen, catastrophic flooding that covered the world, survival of a few in boats or on mountains, animals and seeds deliberately preserved, humanity beginning again from near extinction. We explored those stories in detail. From Mesopotamia, where the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic described 7 days of storms, boats sealed with bitumen, birds sent to test for land, mountains emerging from endless waters, to the Americas, where Aztec world ages, and Mayan creation myths described drowning that ended entire epochs, where Ojibwe and Hopi and dozens of other nations remembered water rising beyond anything normal, to Asia, where Hindu texts described Matsya towing Manu's boat to Himalayan peaks, where Chinese history divided itself by the Great Flood Gun and Yu fought for 13 years, to the Pacific, where island peoples surrounded by ocean still feared the water because they remembered when it rose and swallowed lands, to Europe, where Noah's Ark became the dominant narrative, but Greek and Norse traditions preserved independent memories of catastrophic flooding. The pattern was undeniable. These cultures never met. They developed separately. They couldn't have borrowed these stories from each other. Yet the structural elements matched with precision that defied coincidence. Then we shifted from mythology to geology, and the earth confirmed what the stories claimed. The rocks and ice don't lie. They show catastrophic sea level rise during the exact period the myths describe. Meltwater pulse, 1A and 1B. Periods when sea levels rose tens of meters in decades or centuries. Not gradually, but catastrophically. The Younger Dryas period showing possible comet impacts, massive wildfires, sudden extinction of megafauna, the disappearance of human cultures, and rapid climate chaos. 400 feet of sea level difference between Ice Age and today, drowning millions of square kilometers of coastal plains where human populations would have concentrated. We examined who survived and how. Geography determined survival more than sophistication. Coastal civilizations drowned while mountain populations persisted, simply through luck of elevation. The genetic bottleneck suggesting human population crashed to perhaps 10,000 individuals, and we explored how oral tradition could preserve accurate information across 10,000 years. Aboriginal Australians proving it works. Polynesian navigation confirming it. The structural consistency of flood myths worldwide demonstrating careful preservation rather than creative elaboration. 3 possible explanations emerged. Pure coincidence? Rejected. The statistical probability is too small, and the geological evidence too specific. Archetypal psychology. Interesting, but it doesn't explain why the myths correlate with actual geological events. or why they contain practical details like boat dimensions and bird species. Historical memory? This is where the evidence points. Flood myths preserve genuine human experience of catastrophic flooding during post-glacial sea level rise, mythologized and theologized as cultures wrapped real events in their religious frameworks, but fundamentally historical. We're not claiming certainty. We're not saying we've proven every detail. But historical memory is the most parsimonious explanation, the simplest answer that accounts for all the evidence, the interpretation that makes sense of both the global pattern of myths and the geological record of catastrophe. They remembered because it happened. The water rose catastrophically. Coastal civilizations drowned. Survivors fled to mountains and transmitted warnings through oral tradition that survived 10,000 years to reach us today. But this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just about the past. Because if this pattern is real, it changes how we understand ourselves, our history, and our future. We're not the first civilization. We're just the latest. And everything the first ones built is 400 feet underwater. If we take flood myths seriously as historical memory, several implications follow that should fundamentally change how we understand human civilization. First, we're older than we think. The standard narrative says civilization began around 5,000 years ago. Writing, cities, organized states, complex agriculture, all emerging in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the Indus Valley around 3000 BCE. Before that, primitive hunter-gatherers, small bands, simple societies gradually developing toward complexity. But if advanced coastal civilizations existed 13,000 years ago and were destroyed by catastrophic flooding, that narrative is wrong. We're not the first to reach sophistication. We're survivors, rebuilding from catastrophe. The sudden appearance of agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture around 3000 BCE might not represent invention. It might represent recovery, rediscovery, knowledge preserved through the dark ages after the flood, finally finding fertile ground again once climate stabilized and populations recovered. Second, progress isn't linear. We like to imagine human history as steady advancement from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from simple to complex. But if flood myths preserve real catastrophe, history looks different. Cyclical rather than linear, rising and falling, advancing, collapsing, losing knowledge, rebuilding from fragments, advancing again. The archaeological record hints at this. Sophisticated accomplishments appearing without visible developmental stages. Monuments built with precision we struggle to replicate. Knowledge encoded in structures that seems too advanced for their supposed era. Maybe that's not anomalous. Maybe that's normal. Maybe civilizations reach heights, fall, and the survivors carry forward what fragments they can preserve until conditions allow rebuilding. Third, oral traditions deserve profound respect. If flood myths are proven historical memory, and the evidence increasingly suggests they are, then other myths might preserve genuine knowledge about the deep past. Stories dismissed as fantasy might contain historical cause. Oral histories treated as primitive superstition might maintain accurate information across thousands of years. Western academia has been biased toward written records, assuming oral tradition is inherently unreliable. But Aboriginal Australians remembered coastlines for 10,000 years. Flood myths worldwide preserved structural consistency across hundreds of generations. Maybe we should stop dismissing oral tradition and start taking it seriously as legitimate historical transmission. Fourth, we live in amnesia. We've forgotten that catastrophe is normal on geological timescales. Our stable Holocene period, the past 11,000 years of relatively calm climate that allowed civilization to flourish, is anomalous. For most of human existence, the environment was chaotic. Ice ages, rapid climate shifts, megafauna extinctions, population crashes. The world has ended before, multiple times, and it could end again. But we've forgotten this. We assume stability. We build cities at sea level as though seas are permanent features. We construct complex, fragile systems as though disruption is impossible. We advance technologically without corresponding wisdom about managing that power. We're making the same assumptions every civilization makes. We're special. We're different. Catastrophe can't happen to us. The flood survivors who transmitted these stories understood something we've forgotten. Everything is temporary. Sophistication is fragile. Preservation requires effort. Knowledge must be protected because it can be lost. The world can change catastrophically. And when it does, geography matters more than merit. Luck matters more than wisdom. And survival requires humility. Flood myths aren't just teaching us that water rose. They're teaching us about time, change, fragility, and the human condition. They're saying, you think you're permanent, but you're not. You think your knowledge is secure, but it isn't. You think tomorrow will resemble today, but it might not. But this isn't just about understanding the past. If flood myths preserve memory of real catastrophe, then they also preserve a warning. Because what happened once can happen again. They survived to warn us. They passed down the memory for 10,000 years. And we're not listening. Many flood traditions explicitly frame themselves as warnings. Noah is commanded to tell future generations about the covenant, about what happened, about why the rainbow appears. Survivors in countless cultures are instructed to remember, to teach their children, to maintain awareness that catastrophe is possible. The stories aren't entertainment. They're alarm systems, cultural warning mechanisms maintained across centuries. What are they warning us about? Obviously, flooding, seas that can rise, waters that can cover the world. But the deeper warning isn't about specific mechanisms. It's about catastrophe itself, about the reality that civilizations fall, that the world can change suddenly and violently, that nothing is permanent, that what seems stable can collapse. We face our own catastrophic risks, some similar to ancient floods. Climate change causing sea level rise, though more slowly than younger dryers, but affecting billions more people. Most coastal cities built at elevations that assume seas won't change. Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Bangkok, all vulnerable, not to 40-day floods, but to century-long rises that will still displace populations and destroy infrastructure on scales we can barely imagine. But we also face risks ancient peoples never encountered. Nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization in hours. Biological weapons that could trigger pandemics worse than any natural disease. Artificial intelligence advancing toward capabilities we might not control. Ecological collapse from simultaneous pressures on multiple systems. Technological fragility, where single points of failure, electromagnetic pulses, cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions could cascade through entire civilizations. The pattern is the same though. Advancing capability without corresponding wisdom, power without ethics, complexity creating fragility, systems optimized for efficiency becoming vulnerable to disruption. The same hubris that flood myths warn against. Assuming we're special, assuming we're safe, assuming catastrophe can't happen to us. The lesson flood survivors learned at terrible cost was this: civilizations fall, knowledge is lost, warnings are forgotten, and hubris invites catastrophe. The deepest meaning of flood myths isn't the water, it's the forgetting. Every civilization thinks it's permanent. Every society assumes its knowledge is secure. Every generation believes it can't happen to us right up until the moment it does. The Mesopotamians thought their civilization would last forever. The coastal peoples during the Ice Age had no reason to think the seas would rise. They'd lived on those shores for thousands of years. The water had always been there at that level. Why would it change? But it did change. Catastrophically. And everything they'd built drowned. We're making the same assumption. We think our civilization is stable. We think our knowledge is secure. Digital archives, cloud storage, distributed systems. We think catastrophe is something that happened to ancient peoples, primitive societies without our technology and sophistication. But sophistication makes us fragile. Our complex systems have more failure points. Our specialized knowledge means fewer people understand foundational processes. Our optimization for efficiency has eliminated redundancy that provided resilience. The flood myths are trying to tell us something. Catastrophe is always possible. Preparation matters. Humility is survival. Memory serves as protection. Don't assume tomorrow will resemble today. Don't assume your world is permanent. Don't assume warnings don't apply to you. They survived to warn us. They made certain their descendants would know that the world had ended before, that it could end again, that the signs should be recognized, that preparation should happen before crisis, not during. And we're not listening. We're dismissing the stories as primitive mythology. We're ignoring the warnings because they come wrapped in religious frameworks we don't share. We're assuming our technology makes us immune to the forces that destroyed previous civilizations. But the water is still there. The ice sheets are still melting. The climate is still changing. The risks are still real. And the pattern keeps repeating. Advancement without wisdom, power without ethics, complexity without resilience, hubris without humility. So we've traced the pattern across the world, through time, from myth to geology to meaning. But there's one question left. the most personal question. What do we do with this? How should understanding this change us?